Hi guys, and welcome back. So in the last video, what we did is we generated the necessary certificate files for each of the nodes in our cluster. And then earlier, we created the kubeadm configuration file for each of the nodes in our cluster as well. So we need to copy all of these files over to each of the appropriate nodes. Now, of course, node number 1, since we ran these commands on it, already has all the files in the correct location, but nodes number 2 and 3, we need to make sure that we update accordingly. So what they don't mention here in between these steps is that you need to make sure that your node number 1 can SSH into node number 2 and 3. So to do that, what we need to do is get our private key that we generated for our virtual machines. So let's do cat downloads and then etcd key pair. And I'm going to take this private key and I'm going to copy it to my clipboard locally. And then we'll close that tab. And on node number 1 here, I'm going to go ahead and create the .ssh directory, which looks like it already exists. And then I'm going to vim.ssh/idrsa, which is the standard file system path for the private key that you're going to use for your account. And we'll just paste that in. So now I should be able to do ssh ubuntu at etcd02, and it looks like it won't be able to resolve the DNS name. However, if we do an SSH command to one of these IP addresses, we should be able to do that. So let's try plugging in one of these IPs here. Say yes to the host fingerprint, and it's saying permission denied, and that's probably because when we ran sudo-es, it's actually still using the environment from Ubuntu, the Ubuntu user account. So let's do echo home. And you can see it's actually pointing to the Ubuntu home directory. So I'm going to, let's say, move the .ssh/idrsa file to home/.ssh/ and just leave that. And it looks like it says that's the same file there. You'll also want to set the permissions on the file to 400 just to make sure that you are not going to get this permissions warning indicating that your private key has 2 open permissions. So go ahead and just do a chmod on that. And then what we're going to do is just rerun this SSH command to hop onto another virtual machine here. And I'm actually just going to specify the path to the file just to make sure that we're being explicit about the path to our private key file. And as you can see, we're able to SSH in now. So now we're SSH'd from node number 1 into node number 2. So I'll exit out of that session, and then we'll just test out node number 3 as well. So let's find out what his IP address is. And it looks like node number 3 is going to be this last one here. So we'll copy that IP address, and then we'll go ahead and run our SSH command here again, but I'm going to paste in the other IP address for node number 3. And as you can see, we are able to access it just fine. So now we can take these steps from this documentation over here to go ahead and copy the files to the appropriate node and then move them to the correct location. Now what you're going to notice that right down here, these steps are actually being run as the remote shell. So we're going to run these first couple commands by themselves, and then we're going to get SSH'd into that remote node, and then we're going to run these commands right here on that remote shell. So it's a little bit confusing. You can't just like copy this whole thing right here and just run it by itself. So let's do this for host 1, and then we'll come back and do it for host number 2. Or actually, I should say host number 2 and then host number 3. All right, so we're going to set our user to Ubuntu, our host to host number 1. So if we echo host, you're going to see that that's the IP address for host number 2, even though the variable is 1 because it's 0 based instead of 1 based. And now what we want to do is run this scp command to scp or secure copy the files for the current host over to the remote host. Now we're going to need to also specify our ID file or our identity file. So that's going to be .ssh/idrsa. All right, so we've copied all those files to that remote host, and now we need to go ahead and move them to the correct location, and we'll do that with an SSH command here. So we'll SSH into that remote machine. I'll pass in my identity file here again. Make sure we can authenticate. And let's go ahead and run sudo-es to elevate on that remote machine. And then we'll change ownership of the PKI directory. And then we're going to go ahead and move the PKI directory to etc Kubernetes. So if we just do ls-lr, you can see that we've got under our home directory on this remote node, we've got this PKI and PKI/etcd directory. So we're just going to move that entire PKI directory over to etc Kubernetes. So now we're done with that, so we'll exit out twice. We want to exit out from the elevated shell, and then we want to exit out from node number 2 entirely. And now we want to do the exact same thing for node number 3. So if you hit up arrow a couple of times and just change host 1 to host 2, we can run these exact same commands because they are variabilized. So I'm going to do the scp command here, and then we'll run the ssh command to get a remote shell. And then we're going to go ahead and run the sudo command to elevate on node number 3. Then we'll go ahead and change ownership of the PKI directory recursively to root. And then we're going to go ahead and move the PKI directory over to etc Kubernetes. Great, so now we've copied all of the files from node number 1 over to node number 2 and 3. So at this point, we can come back to node number 1 for now. So you can run a verification step here, and this would basically just confirm on the remote node that all of the files are in the correct location. We're actually on node number 1 here. So we should have a kubeadm CFG file for host number 1, and then we should have the PKI directory here as well. So let's just do a quick ls-lr on /temp and figure out which IP address we're going to be looking at. So we're going to look at node number 1 here, and that's going to be 61.35. We'll do 172.31.61.35. And as you can see, we've got the kubeadm CFG file here. And the other files that we need to be looking for on this node are under etc Kubernetes PKI, and we should have this folder structure on that node. So let's just do a quick ls-lr under /etc Kubernetes /PKI. And sure enough, all these files are in the correct locations here. We've got the API server keys, which we're not really going to be using because that's more for the actual API server itself. And then under the etcd directory here, we have the CA public key and the CA private key. And then we could do the same thing on the other nodes as well, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and let you run those commands as well, so you could SSH into the other nodes. Actually, I've already got these other sessions here in separate panes, and you could run those same commands just to confirm that everything is in the correct location. All right, so once you've got all of the files copied into the correct file system locations on those nodes, we need to actually create the etcd service. And so to do that, we're going to be calling out to the kubeadm utility to run the etcd phase on the local system. And we're going to do that on each of the nodes separately. So there's going to be one command for node 1, a command for node 2, and a command for node 3. So let's copy the first command, and we'll run that on node number 1. And you can see it says creating static pod manifest for local etcd. And if you just do cat etc Kubernetes manifests and then etcd.yaml, this is the pod manifest that's going to basically tell the kubelet to spin up the etcd service on the local system. Now we need to do the same thing on the other systems as well. So what we'll do is just come back to our docs here, and you can see that there's no difference between the command that you run on node 2 and node 3. So what we're going to do is just come back here. We'll go to node 2, sudo-es. We'll run kubeadm, and it says creating static pod manifest, and then we'll do the same thing on node number 3. And if you get disconnected from your SSH session, go ahead and just re-SSH into that remote node and do sudo-E lowercase s. So we'll run this kubeadm on our third node here, and so now all of our nodes have the pod manifest running on the kubelet for each of these nodes. So at this point, we should have the etcd cluster up and running, but we need to go ahead and verify that. So in the next video, we're actually going to run the command to check the cluster health and then take a look at some of the other commands available on the etcd ctl command line utility. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.